Just a few days ago, a joint statement from U.S. President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney sent shockwaves through global markets. The two leaders announced they're aiming to reach a comprehensive trade and security agreement within 30 days. It's a surprising shift in tone after a volatile start to the G7 summit in Alberta, Canada. At this moment, Trump and Carney are engaged in a private meeting on the sidelines of the summit. The footage you're seeing was captured only a few days ago. But the real story lies behind the scenes. President Trump arrived at the summit armed with a 25% tariff policy that ignited tensions instantly. Canada, however, responded not with press conferences or fiery speeches. Prime Minister Carney withheld Canada's signature from the G7's final communique, but with silence, a rare and strategic move that left Washington reeling. Meanwhile, Europe stepped in, pledging a $150 billion Ukraine fund, and signaling it would not be sidelined. Now, the world watches. Will this clash turn into a full-scale trade war? Or will it leave America increasingly isolated? From quiet resistance at the G7 meeting table to high-stakes ICE raids in Chicago, and from a viral pro-steel movement in Canada to sharp rebukes from Paris and Berlin, the 2025 tariff battle is fast becoming a global turning point. Canada is drafting tariffs on U.S. whiskey. The EU is fortifying its battery sector. Japan is getting ready to take its case to the WTO. And back in the U.S., inflation and foreign policy isolation are closing in fast. This moment marks the first major challenge of Trump's turbulent second term. The G7 summit, perched in the Alberta Rockies, was supposed to bring unity among Western allies. Instead, it's revealed a deep fracture. Even before the summit began, disagreements over steel tariffs, clean energy subsidies, and EV policies had set Canada and the U.S. on a collision course. But no one predicted how quickly it would erupt. Once the White House confirmed the implementation of sweeping 25% tariffs on all imports, plus 10% duties on energy, Carney took a bold, unconventional path. He chose silence, no press briefings, no photo ops, no handshake with Trump, and no endorsement of the summit's concluding statement. The joint G7 family photo canceled. It was the first strategic silence ever recorded at a G7 summit, and it put the U.S. immediately on the defensive. Trump responded with threats to double tariffs to 50%. In return, Canada launched its MASH Stand with Steel campaign. Within 72 hours, Canadian businesses across cities from Montreal to Windsor recalibrated raw material prices. Detroit's auto parts suppliers were forced to slash their profit projections for the first quarter. At the same time, Europe launched a counteroffensive. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called Trump's tariffs a minefield threatening global trade, and followed it up with real action. A $150 billion Ukraine Solidarity Fund, an EU-wide rare mineral pool, and expanded subsidies for domestic green technologies. The message to Washington was clear: go it alone, and we'll use our market size as leverage. Then came the diplomatic rupture. French President Emmanuel Macron called Trump's suggestion to invite Russia and China into the G7 a rebranding into a G9, a direct assault on shared democratic values. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stood firm, stating, "There can be no seat at our table for a Moscow that bombs Kyiv." The unity between Europe and the U.S. no longer looked like two tracks in alignment. It was now a head-on collision. Back in the U.S., the chaos spilled onto domestic streets. ICE launched Operation Safe Haven in Chicago, targeting undocumented immigrants in dawn raids. Hundreds were detained in the Little Village neighborhood. The ripple effect hit industries like agriculture, hospitality, and construction. Economists warned that the twin effects of labor shortages and import costs would quietly drive inflation higher. A hidden tax on the American consumer. Behind closed doors in Ottawa, Carney made another powerful move. He didn't need a camera or a crowd. He simply pulled the draft summit text that Canada had prepared. Usually, the host nation submits a well-crafted closing statement for others to amend. This time, there was no draft. No tweaks, no nod from Japan, no grammar requests from Germany, no final signatures. Unless the U.S. reversed course, there would be no final word from the G7. It was a quiet but calculated blow. Canada's megaphone moment in global diplomacy. This isn't the measured diplomacy of Biden's time, or the Asia-first strategy of Obama's years. Trump's new term has taken a raw, confrontational tone. The last time steel tariffs triggered this level of chaos was 2018, but this round comes with sharper stakes and deeper consequences. The economic damage is already visible. The Toronto Stock Exchange dropped over 8% in 2 days. While some of that was driven by investor panic, the rest was real: increased input costs. Overnight, 3 major foundries in Ontario reduced shift. Workers lined up at union offices asking a grim question: are we looking at weeks or months without pay? Even Ontario's Conservative Premier, usually not an ally of Carney, stood behind the federal government's plan for retaliatory tariffs. U.S. products from whiskey to motorcycles to agricultural goods and semiconductors will now face retaliatory tariffs between 25% and 40%. For the first time, Canada broke its traditional ally exemption under NAFTA. Europe echoed this assertive stance. Ursula von der Leyen, while speaking at the Alberta summit, went off script. "Tariffs are taxes," she declared, "and taxes are bills, and bills go to the people." Her words landed hard, not just on world leaders but on consumers everywhere. Just this morning, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stepped onto the G7 stage in Alberta with a 5-point declaration that may have fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of the summit and perhaps even the post-American global order. Her bold proposal included a $50 billion expansion of the European Chip Act, direct involvement of the European Investment Bank in securing rare earth minerals from Congo and Gabon, a $150 billion macro financial package to support Ukraine, completion of the EU-Canada Green Hydrogen Corridor by 2030, and the creation of a Northern European electric vehicle battery hub. More than a policy package, it was a declaration of independence from Washington's tariff threats, a roadmap to reroute supply chains and decouple strategic industries from U.S. control. French President Emmanuel Macron followed with pointed sarcasm, dismissing Trump's idea of buying Greenland with a smirk. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz was even more direct, saying flatly that unless Russia withdraws from Luhansk, it will not be allowed back into any expanded G8. In short, the message was clear. Europe was done playing along. So why did Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney remain silent while others made noise? Because Carney had been here before. In the previous steel crisis, Trump had publicly shredded a signed joint statement just hours after endorsing it, via a tweet. This time, Carney opted for a new tactic. No signature, no photo, no handshake. Ottawa would not be used again for political theater that ends in betrayal. In Carney's view, this wasn't a summit to argue with Trump. It was a stage for middle powers to quietly reposition themselves in a new world order. When the EU unveiled its Ukraine Fund and Green Industry Plan, it wasn't just responding to tariffs. It was signaling that it no longer needed U.S. financial backing. Meanwhile, Japan filed a formal WTO complaint over American steel tariffs. Mexico started preparing legal action to avoid being punished by U.S. asylum policies. India, while only attending as a guest, showed interest in the Canada-EU Critical Minerals Corridor. Washington may have sat at the center of the G7 table, but the rest of the table was already drawing a new layout. Behind the scenes, the G7 protocol team scrambled. There would be no official group photo because Carney made his participation conditional on a rollback of the U.S. tariffs. The U.S. Trade Representative left 4 bilateral sessions with no deal and no joint statement. Instead, Trump departed with a parting line. "We'll sign in Washington." As Air Force One lifted off, photojournalists scrambled to catch the only symbolic image, Trump waving in sunglasses from the steps of the plane. For the first time ever, a G7 summit ended with no signed agreement and no group photograph, a void louder than any press release. Yet while cameras focused on Alberta, America's domestic scene was also unraveling. ICE agents raided Chicago's Little Village neighborhood in an operation dubbed, arresting hundreds of undocumented immigrants, many without criminal records. The White House touted it as the largest deportation drive in U.S. history. But for business leaders, it was a blow to an already tight labor market. With steel tariffs driving up prices and labor shortages hobbling industries from agriculture to logistics, a new kind of inflation was taking hold, fueled by a mix of border politics and trade wars. From California's almond orchards to Texas's oil fields, productivity was falling. Supply chain shocks collided with shrinking workforces. Moody's and Fitch responded by downgrading the U.S. growth forecast by 1.5 percentage points. Inside the Beltway? Silence. Not a single administration official stepped forward to explain the economic fallout. Abroad, the map of global trade was rapidly redrawn. Europe, Japan, and Canada weren't just reacting. They were actively building Plan B, a post-American trade network. From green hydrogen and semiconductors to EV batteries and rare earth elements, the momentum was shifting. The Alberta G7 summit became a watershed moment. A rupture in the post-Cold War, U.S.-led global alignment. Carney's silence spoke louder than Trump's tariffs. The EU raised its voice. Asia opened trade bridges. The IMF and World Bank recalibrated their global risk assessments. Suddenly, the G7 looked less like a harmonized orchestra led by Washington, and more like a disjointed ensemble with independent ambitions. Europe, Canada, and Japan linked arms. and put forth a version of globalization that doesn't rely on the US. Even NATO unity started to wobble. Trump pressed allies to commit to a 5% defense budget benchmark. Not one capital agreed, everyone sensed the shift. And now, the world faces an uncomfortable question. Will the US remain behind the tariff wall it built, or rejoin its allies with substance over bluster? As of now, the US is growing quieter, boxed in by its own policies. Canada has turned silence into a strategic tool. Europe has replaced hesitation with coordination. Asia is hedging both sides, and global institutions are quietly reshuffling their forecasts. What happened in Alberta won't be remembered for a handshake or a group photo. It will be remembered for its absence, and for the silent but seismic realignment of global power. If the US continues on its current path, the next G7 summit might have to find a new host. In this world, the loud clang of steel presses may cost more than the calm clarity of diplomacy. Because in economics and geopolitics alike, the true cost of leadership gaps always shows up in raw material prices, consumer bills, and shattered alliances.